been to the North Carolina Museum of History and seen the two bronze statues outside. I think there's one of Sir Walter Raleigh or Drake or whoever. The other one is the Saratown woman, and that is a forensic reconstruction of a grave that was being looted in January 1972 at Upper Saratown that led to our starting our research there that summer. And UNC, the Research Laboratories of Archaeology where I work, spent 10 summers excavating up there. I was there for the first 3 summers. But then when I came back in '83, we decided that we wanted to build on that work and develop a more formalized research design focusing on the impact of the European presence on native peoples in central North Carolina, southern Virginia, northern South Carolina. Our first 4 summers were at Hillsborough. We started by going back to a site called the Wall site that had been dug in the late 30s and early 40s and was interpreted at the time as being the archaeological remains of the historic Occoneechee village that John Lawson visited in February of 1701. It turned out that those archaeological remains were actually of a late pre-contact settlement, occupied mostly in the 16th century, maybe very early into the 17th or early 1600s, but it was pre-contact. With that realization, we began looking elsewhere, and we found adjacent to it, only about 400 feet away, what we call the Frederick site, which contained archaeological evidence of a village occupied right at the beginning of the 18th century, so right at the time of John Lawson, and that's the site we've interpreted as Occoneechee. There's also material evidence that connects it ceramically with some of the artifacts that have been found at Fort Christiana, which is where the Occoneechee went by the 17 teens. So anyway, so that kind of got us going with our research. For the next, I guess until about 2001, with support from the National Science Foundation, National Geographic Society, we excavated more than a dozen sites at various locations across the Piedmont. However, Hillsborough was about as close as we got to Chapel Hill. There's a couple of sites over on the Hall River, not too far away. Then in 2001, Treywick retired, we hired a new archaeologist, and we decided to kind of shift gears a little bit and begin focusing on what happened to the native peoples in this area in the 18th century after this region had been largely depopulated. Those groups didn't simply die off. Most of them combined with other groups to maintain viable societies, and eventually they went in one of 2 directions. Some, like the Occoneechee and Saponi, wound up at Fort Christiana under protection of the Virginia colonial government, and then that community began to fragment in the 1720s, and some of those peoples moved back into this area, and that's the Occoneechee Band of Saponi Nation, state-recognized tribe. They try to trace their ancestry to that community. Other groups, like some of the indigenous groups living here in the second quarter of the 1600s, who we know about from the writings of an explorer named John Lederer, the Eno, the Shakori, the Adshusheer, these are, and the Saxpahal. Those are the groups that we think represent the indigenous population at first contact with Europeans. And they developed from an archaeological complex archaeologists identify as the Hillsborough phase, which begins about 1400 or so and extends up into the 1600s. And evidence of that archaeological phase extends from Greensboro to about Durham, and north almost to the Caswell County line, south to about where the dam for Jordan Lake is. So it's a pretty large area of people living who produced similar styles of pottery, which we interpret as suggesting that they're culturally connected. To what degree we don't know how their political relationships were. We don't know any of that, but culturally we say they're quite similar to one another and different from people that live further afield. So anyway, many of these groups, or the remnants of these groups, wound up leaving this area in the early 1700s, moving down along the Catawba River south of Charlotte, and joining with groups that were already there, like the Esau, the Shakori, the Catawba, and by about the second, third quarter of the 1700s, they are recognized as the Catawba Indian Nation. So from 2001 until 2019, we did field research down there, hoping to begin by identifying sites that dated to the early 1700s and then tracing those folks up archaeologically into the 1800s. As it turned out, the earliest sites that we could identify dated from the 1750s, at the time of the French and Indian War. At that time, these groups all coalesced. They were living at a location called Nation Ford, which is near present-day Fort Mill, South Carolina. A smallpox epidemic struck the community. There were like 6 villages in 1759. More than half of the Catawba died. They abandoned those settlements, moved 60 miles downriver to Camden, resided there for about 2 years with a Quaker community, and then came back but resettled about 8 miles downriver from their former towns. And this is where the Catawba still are today. And we excavated a number of settlements there dating from the 1760s up to about 1820. And at 1820, we have accounts by travelers, so we know the surnames of the people who lived in these towns. We know some of the direct descendants of those people, because they're still in the tribe today. And so it's taken what we started here, that was late pre-contact, early contact period, and taken it all the way up to a point where it has direct relevance to the descendant population, because we've gone from looking at archaeologically defined cultures to actual families that have living descendants. So for me, that's been kind of the most satisfying part of my archaeological journey, is reaching that direct connection with the descendant community. With John Lawson's writing, when he came through this area, he mentions the Sisquahaw and Saxquahaw living on the Paul River, but never visited their town. He did visit the Occaneechi, stayed there overnight, and then he followed a sad and stony way about 14 miles southeast, southeast of Hillsborough, where the Occaneechi village was, where the great trading path crossed the Eno, and came to the community of Adshusheer, which was the community where Will, his guide, resided, and it was a community of Eno, Shakori, and Adshusheer. So this community is actually a very early coalescent community formed in the wake of initial depopulation of this area. Coalescence is a process that occurs repeatedly, and not just the Indians in this area, just about everybody in the Southeast, all the indigenous groups. In the 18th century were a result of some level of coalescence. Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Catawba in particular. Catawba, 1740s, there's a trader named James Adair who says that there are more than 20 different dialects being spoken in the Catawba Nation, which is an indication of just how culturally diverse. At one point, there was the group of Natchez Indians from the lower Mississippi Valley living among the Catawba. So these are kinds of things that you don't really read about in the history books. And the value of archaeology is it allows us to give a voice to those folks who otherwise would be largely voiceless. And we have to do it often not through written records. Those written records are important because they kind of give us a foothold, but it comes more out of the archaeological evidence that we find that we can associate with those written records. So why are we digging here? One of the sites that Lawson mentions that's never really been located was the town of Adshusheer. We know about how far away from Occoneechee Town it was, and we know the general direction because when Lawson leaves Occoneechee Town, he gets off the trading path and he's heading east toward the settlements on Pamlico River, where the town of Bath would be established just a few years later. And so it's a day's trip to Adshusheer. There have been, over the years, kind of different ideas about where Adshusheer might have been. One was on Ellerby Creek in Durham, but another one is along New Hope Creek, though not at this particular location. A lot of folks have associated it with a site that was recorded in the late 40s, and a small excavation was conducted on the creek bottom behind the old Patterson house. And for years we tried to get permission to work there, and the landowner was never interested. And it had been the early 80s since I had been out there. So when Heather and I were looking at, well, maybe we need to contact this individual again and just see if he'd be willing to let us go out. We said, well, first let's go out and look. And so we went on the Hollow Rock Park side and went down, and then kind of looked across there, and it's just kind of a swampy area. And so, this just doesn't look. So we went back and looked at the collections that had been excavated in the late 40s. They all looked early. So we said, well, that doesn't look right. We had the benefit by this point of having LIDAR, which is I don't know if y'all are familiar. It can give you very high resolution bare earth elevation models. So you can see micro topography and terrain that earlier topographic maps just weren't visible. And started looking at that, and we were saying, wow, these bottoms back here along New Hope Creek, now that seems like a good place to look. Coincidentally, given my retirement's coming up, I started cleaning off my debts. And I'm excavating stratigraphically, and I got back in archaeological time about 6 years, and I came across this newspaper article that a friend of mine, Forrest Hazel, who is a tribal historian for the Occoneechee, had stopped by and given me. He was doing research on something else, and he'd run across it and said, here, I think you might be interested in it. And I looked at it. I didn't read it in detail, but I noticed that it was talking about graves washing out in a flood on the Patterson place. And I said, oh yeah, I've seen the 1940 article about the same thing, which I had in my files, that put it behind the Patterson house. And so, but this time when I found it, I said, maybe I ought to read this in more detail. So I did, and what struck me was that this article was written 70 years earlier. 1940 is talking about something that happened back in 1870. This was June 11th, 1870, and it's an eyewitness account of what was found. And there was a flood that came through the valley. It scoured the bottom, and it washed out 18 Indian graves. And some of those, they wore beads around their necks and shoulders that were kept in the soil perfect and are now in our charge to show anyone who desires to see. This article was from the Hillsborough Recorder, and these artifacts actually went to Hillsborough and were on display for folks to see. So these Indians were wrapped in matting. This is something that we can confirm as a practice of native roots and contact. And planted together, a piece of which was found preserved in one of their graves and is now to be seen in our possession. This type of matting, split cane matting, it's only preserved if it's in contact with copper objects. It's the copper salts that preserve the organic material. We have fragments of these in our collection. So again, indicator of historic era. There were 6 or 7 different kinds of beads. Some blue glass, which blue and white glass beads were predominant kinds of beads that were being traded into this area in the late 1600s, early 1700s. So some others out of soapstone or limestone. My guess is that those are decayed shell beads. Also 2 pieces of pottery, unexplainable hieroglyphs, probably carved paddle stamp, which is a typical style for this period. 2 pieces of small copper pipe, and another piece of a small pipe made exactly in the shape and likeness of a little bugle. Indians at the beginning of the 18th century, late 17th century, were trading for a variety of things, including copper kettles. And they would take the copper and cut it into strips and roll it to make copper beads to be worn. And also they would cut little triangles and roll them in the shape of a bugle. And they're called tinklers, and they sew them onto their garments, and they'll jingle. If you ever go to a powwow, you'll see some regalia has tinklers on it. So anyway, so all of these things, told us that, well, what it told us was that there were graves here that dated to the historic era. Not more than 50 steps opposite these graves were found is a hanging rock that juts 2/3 over the creek, and under it is a hole of water very deep. It's kind of silted in now, but I can tell you where it passes. And this, I had come out here in 1983 on the other side, and as soon as I read that, I said, I know where that is. So Major Patterson says that when he was a boy, the old Negroes said that the Indians used to cut somersaults from the hanging rock into the hole below. But, said the Major, the boys were always afraid to make the leap. It was too high. There's a rock that juts out there behind the Patterson place as well. But it's only about this far above the water. It has these little dimples where it's eroded in pockets. And some folks say, well, that's the hollow rock. No, the hollow rock is right here. And that's clearly what this is referring to. So anyway, so armed with that information, but not a shred of physical evidence that there was a site here, we decided that we were going to have our field school here this summer. And in terms of hedging our bets, we said, well, we'll spend half the field season here, and then we'll move for the last couple of weeks along the Eno River at Airbound and test that area, see if there's other sites that might be associated with the Okadichi village or the Wall site. So anyway, so we started here, and our strategy was to lay out transects of 20 meters apart and excavate shovel tests at 10-foot intervals along those transects. And we started here because this gets us close to 50 paces from where the graves supposedly were found. And let me just stop at that point and say, we're not interested in finding graves. We don't want to find graves. But the importance of the graves is that Native peoples buried their dead in and around their villages. So these graves are not just kind of out there on their own. They are associated with a habitation site. And so that's what we're interested in examining. And as an early coalescent community, we don't know if that habitation site is one village that has groups of at least 3 different tribes, or if there are separate villages that are close by. But that's, for this summer, all we were trying to do is say, okay, is there something here? And we can say definitely there is. And more than that, we can say that what is here is late. Our strategy was to dig those shovel tests and then screen that fill through 1/4-inch mesh and then see what occurred in the soil. And we dug 22 tests, and in about 8 or 9 of those, we mostly found potsherds, small fragments of pottery, or stone flakes from chipping stone tools. Now, the flakes in and of themselves aren't too diagnostic temporally, so it could be like 1700, it could be 1400. The pottery, we know from the style changes that we've been able to map at other sites, that most of the pottery we were finding here probably dates after about 1600. So that's getting us closer. Then we found one clay pipe fragment that has a very fine rouletted design on the exterior of the pipe bowl. And we think that these designs with very fine rouletting are actually made with watch wheels, which would put it into the historic period. And we find similar pipes in historic era sites. We had a number of these pipes and pipe fragments at the Frederick site, historic Okinawan Dam. So, we also, when we got down to soils that contained this late material, we screened it through a 1/4-inch screen, and then we washed it through window screen to see if we could recover glass beads. And we didn't notice any when we were washing it, but we still need to rinse all of this back in the lab, and then we'll sort through it and see. Because on most historic era sites, if you're going to find anything, you'll find glass beads if you use the proper recovery technique.